The steel wheel kicked against my palms as brown water hammered the spillway gate. Below me, 40 homes sat behind evacuation barricades, and Celeste Harrington was screaming that I was about to flood every one of them. 8 months earlier, her HOA had helped me after my winter stockpile burned. Now the black scar from the second fire was still visible beside my barn, and I no longer believed either blaze was an accident. If you were standing where I was, would you turn that wheel? Tell me where you're watching from, because to understand why I did, you have to go back to the night the first fire woke me. The first fire woke me at 2:43 on a February morning, not from the flames, but from the generator alarm beside my bed. I pulled on my boots, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside into air cold enough to sting my teeth. My winter shed was glowing orange behind the barn. 6 cords of seasoned lodgepole pine, stacked heating pellets, and most of the feed I had set aside until spring were burning faster than I could save them. I killed power to the shed from the exterior disconnect, moved my propane cylinders farther uphill, then called the volunteer fire department. By sunrise, what had taken me all summer to prepare was a steaming black pile in the snow. My name is Nolan Barrett. I was 48, and I made my living repairing pumps, generators, snow equipment, and farm machinery on 31 acres my father left me outside a small Montana mountain town. I had spent enough years maintaining municipal water equipment to know that panic usually makes mechanical problems worse. So while the fire marshal worked, I photographed everything before touching it. The breaker panel, the burn pattern, the outlet feeding the shed, the footprints churned into the snow by firefighters. I even wrote down the time my generator alarm had triggered. The preliminary theory embarrassed me because it made sense. An electrician had warned me months earlier that the exterior circuit was aging, and I had postponed replacing it. I had been too busy fixing everybody else's equipment to finish my own. Then Celeste Harrington arrived from Hawthorne Ridge, the 40-home subdivision below my property. 3 years earlier, she had brought me coffee at 2 in the morning while I cleared storm debris from my retention basin. We disagreed about plenty, but I had considered her competent and fair. That morning, she organized residents to bring me replacement firewood. Maya Torres, an emergency room nurse from the lower loop, showed up with her teenage son and a pickup loaded to the rails. Celeste stood beside the ashes and said, "You have kept water off our streets more times than people realize. Let us return the favor." I believed her. That mattered later. The fire marshal found nothing conclusive beyond an electrical source being possible, so I accepted the loss, called my insurer, and started cleanup. Near the back fence, I shoveled a layer of wet charcoal into a wheelbarrow and saw something bright beneath it. A short piece of orange survey ribbon had melted around a metal fence staple. I almost tossed it away. Instead, I dropped it into an old coffee can with a few burned fasteners and set it on my workbench. I had never hired a surveyor that winter, and when I walked back outside and checked the fence line, I found 3 fresh orange ribbons disappearing through the trees toward my retention basin. I followed the ribbons on foot the next morning. They ran along my western fence for about 200 yards, then turned uphill toward the retention basin my father had built decades before Hawthorne Ridge existed. At the last marker, I found a wooden survey stake stamped with the name Ridgeline Civil. I photographed it and called the number printed beneath the logo. The project manager sounded confused when I gave him my parcel number. "We were contracted to mark a proposed stormwater access corridor," he said. "For Hawthorne Ridge." I asked who had authorized access to my land. There was a pause. Our client represented that access had been coordinated with the property owner. Nobody had coordinated anything with me. I told him to stop all work until he could produce written permission, then drove down to the Hawthorne Ridge clubhouse with the photograph on my phone. Celeste did not deny hiring them. She stayed calm, poured coffee, and explained that the subdivision's insurer wanted updated drainage information. "This is not an attempt to take your property, Nolan. We are trying to document infrastructure that protects 40 households." That word stopped me. Infrastructure. My basin was private. My father had built it for our acreage, and I had maintained it voluntarily because runoff did not care about parcel lines. I told her that did not make it an HOA facility. Celeste surprised me by agreeing. Then she slid a 1-page letter across the table. She wanted my signature confirming that I intended to continue maintaining the basin and providing ongoing stormwater mitigation serving Hawthorne Ridge. I read that sentence twice. "I cannot sign this." Her expression changed, but only slightly. Why? Because I am not your stormwater contractor. She offered to rewrite it. Then she offered annual maintenance money. Finally, she mentioned purchasing a recorded easement so the HOA could guarantee access if I sold the property. Those were legitimate things to discuss, which made the secret survey harder to understand. I asked why she had not started with them. Celeste folded her hands. Because insurance is getting difficult in mountain communities and uncertainty scares buyers. I left without signing. That afternoon, I called Ridgeline Civil again and requested the date their original work order had been issued. The manager emailed me a copy after removing pricing information. I expected to see that week's date. Instead, the authorization was almost 4 months old. I opened the photograph of the melted orange ribbon from the fire and compared the company name printed faintly along its edge. Ridgeline Civil. Someone working on Celeste's drainage project had been behind my winter shed months before she ever asked permission, and the survey order had been issued before the shed burned. I did not accuse Celeste of arson. A survey ribbon proved trespass, not who started a fire, and I knew the difference. Instead, I drove to Ridgeline Civil and asked to see the corridor they had been hired to map. Their project manager, Evan Cole, pulled up an aerial image and traced a narrow strip. From the subdivision boundary, past my burned shed, straight to the basin's service road. The HOA wanted emergency vehicle access to the control structure, he said. I pointed at the spillway. They do not control that structure. Evan stopped moving the cursor. He had been told Hawthorne Ridge possessed maintenance rights. That was the first time I understood Celeste had not merely been reassuring buyers. She had been presenting my cooperation as something the HOA could count on. I asked Evan what problem had triggered the survey. He would not release his client's engineering report, but his answer told me enough. There were questions about long-term drainage reliability. I went directly to Celeste. This time there was no coffee. I placed the survey map between us and asked whether she had told contractors the HOA possessed rights on my property. I told them we were working toward formalizing access. That is not the same thing. She exhaled and finally dropped the polished sales voice. Hawthorne Ridge's insurance renewal had exposed a problem. The subdivision's original drainage assumptions depended partly on upstream retention, but nobody had secured permanent rights to my basin when the development was built. Celeste had discovered that gap months earlier. She had 9 home sales tied to Hawthorne Ridge, 2 current closings, and 40 owners who believed their drainage protection was settled. If I tell everyone we have an unresolved stormwater issue before I have a solution, people panic, insurers panic, buyers walk, she said. So you tried to create the solution on my property before telling me. She looked embarrassed rather than defiant. I was trying to keep 40 families from paying for a paperwork failure that happened years before I became president. For a second, I understood her. Then I asked why the proposed corridor passed directly through the location of my winter shed. She looked at the map and went quiet. She said Ridgeline had chosen the route, not her. I left with less certainty about the fire, not more. 2 days later, Celeste called an emergency HOA meeting and invited me to explain the basin arrangement to residents. I agreed, thinking transparency might finally calm things down. Instead, when I walked into the clubhouse, a drainage diagram was projected on the wall. My basin was colored blue. Hawthorne Ridge was colored green. And across my private property, in bold letters, someone had already labeled the proposed corridor. Permanent HOA emergency access. I stood beneath that projected map, while 40 homeowners stared at a right the HOA did not possess. Celeste stepped beside the screen and called the corridor a proposed continuity measure. But the label said permanent access, and nobody in that room heard the difference. I kept my voice level. There is no recorded easement across my parcel. Nobody from this board has authority to enter my land or operate my spillway. A man near the front immediately asked what happened if I refused. Before I could answer, Celeste said, "Then we may have to reconsider whether Hawthorne Ridge can rely on Mr. Barrett's continued cooperation." It was careful wording. It also made me look like the problem. Questions came fast. Insurance, flooding, property values. One homeowner asked whether I could simply shut the basin down. Frustrated, I made the mistake Celeste needed. If your board keeps coming onto my property, I stopped touching that basin. The room went silent. Maya Torres stared at me from the second row. Celeste did not argue. She just reached over and stopped the digital recorder on the table. By noon the next day, a 20-second audio clip of my statement was circulating through the neighborhood without the trespass warning that came before it. Someone left a handwritten note on my gate calling me a flood threat. 2 days later, my mailbox was painted with the words Flood US Then. I installed a replacement without responding. Maya caught me tightening the last bolt. My house is on the lower loop, she said. My kids sleep there. If you are angry at Celeste, why are they part of it? I started explaining that the basin was mine, then stopped. She had not asked who owned it. She had asked who would pay for my fight. That evening I walked the service road alone and checked the staff gauge. Snowmelt was normal. The gate was sound. Mechanically, nothing had changed. Strategically, everything had. I had spent my life solving problems by putting my own hands on them, and Celeste had turned that habit into leverage. As long as everyone believed I alone controlled their safety, every disagreement could be framed as Nolan Barrett threatening 40 families. So I changed tactics. I called my insurance carrier and disclosed the dispute. Then I hired an independent hydrologist, Dr. Laura Bennett, to evaluate the basin and downstream drainage without using the HOA's assumptions. Finally, I contacted County Emergency Management and asked what responsibilities would apply if a future storm required a controlled release. Laura arrived 3 days later with old subdivision drawings Celeste had finally provided under pressure from her own board. She studied them for less than 10 minutes before pointing to 3 downstream culverts. Nolan, she said, these dimensions do not match what is on the ground. We drove downhill and measured them. Decorative stonework, landscaping fill, and private driveway modifications had narrowed all 3. Laura looked back toward the mountain. If your basin ever gets near emergency level, holding the water may be more dangerous than releasing it. Then she checked the forecast on her phone and handed it to me. A warm rain event was forming over a deep mountain snowpack. Laura's warning changed the meeting I scheduled the next morning. I did not threaten Celeste, and I did not ask Hawthorne Ridge to trust me. I brought Laura the measurements, photographs of the narrowed culverts, and a written maintenance proposal that separated my private basin from the subdivision's responsibilities. Celeste arrived with 2 board members and looked exhausted rather than combative. For nearly an hour, we negotiated. The HOA would stop entering my property without permission. Ridgeline Civil would remove its stakes. Hawthorne Ridge would hire its own engineer to evaluate the downstream restrictions. In return, I agreed to keep monitoring the basin while both sides worked toward a properly recorded maintenance agreement. The biggest concession came from Celeste. She agreed to disclose the unresolved drainage issue to all 40 homeowners before asking me for any easement. For the first time in months, the pressure eased. Maya called that afternoon and said, "That sounds a lot different from flooding us." I told her she had been right to challenge me. Before sunset, 3 residents helped me replace the vandalized mailbox. Even Celeste sent an email confirming that no HOA contractor had permission to cross my parcel. I printed it and put it in my records. It felt like we had finally dragged the problem into daylight. Then the weather system weakened and shifted north. Laura said we had time. I used that breathing room to rebuild my winter supply before the next cold season. I changed the layout completely. The propane cylinders stayed in a separate approved location. An electrician replaced the old circuit. I installed heat sensors, motion lights, and 3 overlapping cameras with off-site storage. I also kept the service lane to the basin clear. If another emergency came, nobody could claim my woodpile blocked access. For several weeks, nothing happened. Then Celeste stopped answering questions about the homeowner disclosure. 1 board member resigned. 2 pending buyers requested drainage documents, and I heard through Maya that their closings had stalled. Celeste came to my shop one evening carrying a revised easement offer. The number was generous. I told her I would consider it after every homeowner received the engineering information. She stared at the contract between us. If that disclosure goes out now, people could lose sales they have spent years building toward. Then they deserve to know before they sell to somebody else. She gathered the papers and left without another word. 3 nights later, at 3:06 in the morning, every heat sensor on my phone triggered at once. I opened the camera feed and saw flames climbing the rebuilt winter shed. A landscaping truck was already moving down my service lane. This time the cameras caught the vehicle, the driver, and a man carrying a fuel container behind the building. I called the fire department and the sheriff before I stepped outside. By dawn, my second winter stockpile was gone. But when I checked the fireproof cabinet beside the shed, I understood the fire had not been set just to destroy my supplies. The cabinet door had been forced open, and inside it were 11 years of handwritten basin maintenance logs someone had apparently come there to find. The cabinet had done exactly what I bought it to do. Its outer paint was blistered and the lock had been damaged, but the paper inside was still readable. 11 years of dates, water levels, debris removals, gate adjustments, and photographs proved something Celeste had spent months trying to blur. Hawthorne Ridge had benefited from my work, but the HOA had never maintained or controlled the basin. I handed the cabinet to the sheriff's investigator without removing a page. The camera footage gave him something even better. The landscaping truck belonged to Dean Mercer, the contractor Hawthorne Ridge used for snow removal and grounds maintenance. Dean had also been present during the earlier survey work. Deputies interviewed him that afternoon. By evening, he asked to speak again with an attorney present. What came out changed the entire fight. Celeste had instructed Dean to enter my property and photograph the maintenance records because the HOA's insurer was demanding proof that the basin had been consistently serviced. She had told him the records could determine whether Hawthorne Ridge remained insurable, but Dean said Celeste never told him to start a fire. According to his statement, a motion light came on while he was forcing the cabinet. He panicked, saw the cameras, and used fuel from his equipment to ignite material near the shed, hoping the fire would destroy evidence that he had trespassed. That did not excuse Celeste. Her own email promising that no HOA contractor had permission to enter my land was sitting in my records while she was privately sending Dean there anyway. But I could no longer honestly claim she had ordered the second fire. The truth was messier and more dangerous. Celeste had built a system of pressure and secrecy that someone else had pushed further than she intended. When she came to my property the next afternoon, she looked nothing like the woman who had controlled that clubhouse meeting. She did not deny sending Dean. I needed those logs, she said. The insurer gave us a deadline. So you sent somebody onto my land after putting in writing that you would not. She looked at the burned shed. I did not tell him to do this. I believed that part. I also realized belief no longer mattered. Laura called before Celeste left. The storm that had shifted north had reorganized and was coming back stronger, carrying warm rain over the mountain snowpack. The basin was already higher than normal for the season. County Emergency Management wanted continuous readings starting that night. Celeste heard enough of the call to understand. Her face went pale. "Keep the gate closed," she said. Laura, still on speaker, answered before I could. "That may not be an option." Her latest calculations showed that if we held everything back and the basin overtopped, the release could become uncontrolled. A planned discharge would flood property downstream. An overtopping event could threaten people. Then Laura gave us the number that ended the argument. Based on the narrow drainage system, there was no controlled release large enough to protect the basin that would leave any of Hawthorne Ridge's 40 properties completely unaffected. Laura's number took revenge off the table. From that moment on, my job was not to punish Hawthorne Ridge. It was to make sure nobody could hide behind me when the water arrived. I sent County Emergency Management my 11 years of basin logs, Laura's measurements, the original drainage drawings, and photographs of the narrowed culverts. Then I gave them Celeste's written promise barring HOA contractors from my land and the sheriff's confirmation that Dean had entered anyway. Not because those documents decided when the gate opened. They decided who had authority to stand near it. By evening, county personnel controlled access to the service road while Laura installed a temporary gauge beside my existing staff marker. I kept the mechanical responsibility I actually understood, checking the gate, clearing the intake, testing the hand wheel, and recording water levels every hour. Celeste still had one advantage I did not. She knew the residents. Instead of fighting her for that role, I used it. "You wanted responsibility for 40 homes," I told her. "Tonight you get it. Make sure every one of them receives the warning." She surprised me by nodding. No argument. No sales pitch. She started calling homeowners herself. Maya organized the lower loop and checked on 2 elderly neighbors. The same residents who had once believed I was threatening them were now moving vehicles uphill and carrying important belongings to second floors. Then Celeste tried one last time to control the outcome. She produced a proposed agreement offering me immediate payment if I committed to holding the basin below a specified discharge rate. Laura read it and pushed it back across the table. "That number is not supported by the current conditions." Celeste's hands tightened around the pages. People will lose thousands of dollars if those streets flood. And what happens if the basin overtops? Maya asked. Celeste did not answer. That silence changed the room more than anything I could have said. Around midnight, rain began striking the metal roof of my shop. By 2 in the morning, the temperature had climbed above 40 degrees. Snow that should have stayed locked on the mountain started moving downhill with the rain. The gauge rose faster than Laura's conservative forecast. County Emergency Management ordered the lowest homes evacuated first, then expanded the order as the drainage channels filled. Celeste went door to door with Maya. I stayed at the basin and watched inches disappear from the remaining safety margin. At 4:18, Laura recalculated the inflow and showed me the result. Waiting another hour could eliminate the controlled option entirely. Celeste returned soaked, her golden hair still pinned up except for one strand plastered across her forehead. Everyone is accounted for, she said. Then she looked at the gauge and finally understood what I had been trying to tell her for months. County Emergency Management confirmed the evacuation zone was clear. Laura looked at me. The basin had reached the release threshold. Below us, all 40 homes sat in the path of water that could no longer safely stay behind my gate. The county officer gave the release authorization at 4:24 in the morning. Laura called out the gauge reading while I walked toward the spillway wheel. Rain ran off my dark blue plaid shirt, and the steel handle felt slick through my gloves. Celeste stepped into my path before I reached it. "Give me 30 minutes, she said. Her voice was controlled, but her hands were shaking. "The lower loop is empty. I can get people back in with pumps. We can protect the garages before you release anything." Laura answered from behind me. 30 minutes increases the chance of overtopping. Celeste turned toward her. "You said chance, not certainty." That was the last argument she had, and it was not irrational. Controlled flooding meant known property damage. Waiting offered the possibility that the inflow might slow. It also gambled 40 families' safety on whether none of us controlled. I looked at the gauge, then at Celeste. Months earlier, I would have made that decision alone just because the equipment sat on my land. I was not making that mistake again. "Laura, what is your recommendation?" "Controlled release now." I looked at the county officer. "Evacuation status?" "Confirmed. The affected area is clear." Celeste opened the agreement she had brought earlier and held it toward me. "Sign this. I will accept responsibility for holding the gate." I almost admired the desperation behind it. She was still trying to solve the problem by controlling the paper. "You cannot accept responsibility for physics," I said. Maya had followed her up from the lower loop. She stopped beside us, soaked through, and looked directly at Celeste. "My children are already out. Do not keep water behind that gate to save my drywall." Celeste's face changed. For the first time, the person she had claimed to protect was asking her to stop protecting the property and protect the people instead. She lowered the agreement. Then the basin alarm sounded. One steady electronic tone cut through the ring. Laura checked the gauge and immediately told the county officer the remaining safety margin was shrinking faster than projected. The decision window had closed. I stepped to the wheel. Celeste did not move this time. I wrapped both hands around the cold steel and pulled. Nothing happened. Months of winter exposure had loaded the mechanism harder than my earlier test. I reset my footing and tried again. The wheel gave with a metallic groan. The gate lifted an inch. A dark ribbon of water shot through, then widened as I kept turning. The sound became a low roar that swallowed the rain. Laura watched the gauge. The county officer spoke into his radio. Downhill, emergency lights flashed along streets where 40 houses now stood empty. Celeste stared at the moving water, then at me. "How much of Hawthorne Ridge is this going to reach?" Laura looked at her latest flow estimate before answering. "At this discharge, every property." I put both hands back on the wheel and began opening the spillway to the authorized setting. I opened the gate to Laura's authorized setting and watched the basin level begin to fall. Downhill, the first surge reached the narrowed culverts and backed across Hawthorne Ridge exactly as her calculations predicted. Water crossed every one of the 40 properties. Lower garages and crawl spaces took the worst of it. Lawns disappeared beneath muddy runoff. Driveways became shallow channels, and the subdivision entrance stood in brown water halfway up its stone sign. But the streets were empty. Maya's children were safe uphill. Every resident had been accounted for before I turned that wheel. By daylight, the basin was below emergency level and still intact. The uncontrolled overtopping Laura had warned about never happened. I went downhill with pumps, generators, extension cords, and every piece of drying equipment my repair shop could spare. Maya met me outside her house and handed me a wet power cable without saying anything. Celeste arrived later and started helping residents document damage. She did not blame me again. She could not. The county had the gauge readings, Laura's recommendation, the evacuation record, the original drainage drawings, and measurements showing how landscaping and driveway work had reduced downstream capacity. My 11 years of maintenance logs survived. The second fire and established exactly what I had done for that basin. The same record someone tried to reach when my winter stockpile burned became part of the evidence protecting me afterward. Dean's case moved forward on the documented trespass, property damage, and fire investigation. Celeste's own email promising that no HOA contractor would enter my land, followed by evidence that she sent Dean there anyway, ended her credibility with the board. She turned over the remaining HOA correspondence, and Hawthorne Ridge removed her as president. The association had to deal with its drainage repairs, insurance claims, and the consequences of treating private infrastructure as guaranteed protection. No court magically handed me their neighborhood. Nobody erased 40 mortgages. The solution was less dramatic and far more real. Hawthorne Ridge funded engineering work to restore downstream drainage capacity, and any future use of my basin had to be governed by a written agreement with defined access, maintenance, insurance, and compensation. The basin stayed mine. Months later, I rebuilt my winter stockpile for the third time. New wiring, new shed, same land. Maya and several neighbors helped stack the last cord of pine. I opened the old fireproof cabinet and found the coffee can I had saved after the first fire. Inside was that melted orange Ridgeline survey ribbon, the tiny clue I had almost thrown away. I nailed it above the replacement cabinet, then stepped outside. Far below, all 40 homes were still standing. Above them, the spillway was quiet again. They burned my winter stockpile, twice trying to control what they never owned. In the end, I only had to open the gate.